Okay, chapter 18, The Age of the City. Kind of continuing from where we left off with our last chapter. This chapter is going to be all about the changing American urban landscape. Industrialization changes America in countless ways, but probably the most obvious way is going to be the growth of cities and urban culture in the late 19th, moving into the early 20th centuries. And again, as we mentioned last time, America moves from a primarily rural agrarian society to a predominantly urban one by the 1930s. This is not going to be an easy transition. Cities are literally growing overnight, and society and even government struggle to adapt to these new ways of life. So in this chapter, we are going to be talking about the urbanization of America. We'll be talking about the consumer revolution and really how that sets the stage for modern American society. And lastly, this idea of quote-unquote high culture and this growing divide between the working class and the factory owner class. Okay, let's talk about the urbanization of America. As we've mentioned, between the end of the Civil War all the way up to and even really past 1900, the turn of the new century, we see massive migration into cities in the United States. But this is not just something that is unique to the United States. This is happening all over the Western world. As countries are industrializing, remember, the Industrial Revolution starts in Great Britain and then it spreads out from there. As all these Western nations are industrializing, countries are adapting to a new way of life. The big difference with the United States, the thing that makes us unique, is the fact that our experience with large cities is relatively new. Think about the history of the United States. As we move into the 1900s, there had been large cities in the United States, places like New York or Boston or Philadelphia, only for maybe 150 to 200 years, if that long. And even then, with the exception of places maybe like New York City, our large cities certainly could not compare to London or Paris or Rome, cities that have existed for thousands of years. So that is one way that our experience as we move into an industrial society is different. Not only are we adapting to a new industrial way of life, we're also adapting to new cities, something that we really didn't have a lot of experience with before. And this is not going to be a smooth transition. America's population is growing. We mentioned that last chapter, but very little of that growth is from natural increase. As it turns out, living in cities is not always healthier. Urban dwellers face higher infant mortality rates, higher death rates due to disease, and at the same time, we also have declining fertility rates. As it turns out, as people moved from the countryside into the city, they had smaller families, which makes a certain amount of sense. If you look even, just a few generations back, maybe your grandparents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents, you look at your great-grandparents and they might have had 7 or 8 brothers or sisters. Whereas today, that size family is not the norm. And one of the reasons for that is, in an agrarian society, children represent free labor, right? You have lots of children, that equals lots of farm hands to help out on the farm as they get older. Well, as you move into a more industrial society, children are a liability. They're mouths to feed and they can't really contribute a lot. Now, child labor is going to be a big deal, especially in this time frame that we're looking at. But the fact of the matter was that a child could not help out as much in the city as they could in the countryside. So we actually see the beginnings of smaller families in the United States. The reason that the population is growing is not from natural increase, but from immigration. And we'll talk about immigration a little bit later on. But that is where most of the population increase is coming from. Now, the reasons for city growth in this time period, and I think we've probably covered most of this. Rural folk, again, people moving from the countryside into the cities. opportunities for women, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well. But the city did represent new opportunities for women. Maybe that was in the workplace, although not always. Maybe that was in education, again, not always. But in many different ways, cities did represent opportunities for women. Better paying jobs in these urban factories, and we'll touch on new forms of transportation just a little bit later as well. Okay. But by and large, the late 19th century is going to be a huge time of immigration. We are going to see a flood of immigrants coming into the United States. One thing to keep in mind, and one important distinction during this time period, we are going to see changing sources of immigration. Previously, most immigrants into the United States came from Northern and Western European countries. These are immigrants that probably had a similar political background as to the United States. Maybe they already spoke English. They probably practiced a Protestant form of Christianity. So what I'm getting at here, in the early days, people from Northern and Western Europe assimilated easier into American life. They made the transition into American society more easily. As time goes on and sources of immigration change, no longer Western and Northern Europe, now they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. These immigrants are not always as wealthy. They're not always as educated. Maybe they don't speak English. Maybe they are Catholic instead of Protestant. Maybe they are Jewish or Orthodox Christians. Maybe they physically don't look like people who live in the United States. As these sources of immigration begin to change, these new immigrants are going to find it harder to assimilate into American life. It's the same story as today, right? This is nothing new. If you watch the news, these are the type of things that people talk about all the time these days. The debate over a national language, for example. The expectation that you move to a country and learn a language, that's not a debate that's new to the United States. This has been going on for at least 100 years. And when I say a flood of immigrants, I mean a flood of immigrants. By the time we reach 1900, on average, we are receiving around 1 million immigrants per year. Those are huge numbers of people moving to the United States. And by and large, most of these immigrants are going to settle down in cities, usually because that was their first point of entry into the United States. And without deep resources, if you arrive with the clothes on your back, right, you can't really go out into the United States and find a nice place to settle down. You are where you land. So many of these immigrants stayed in their entry cities, which, as it turns out, was fine for them because that's where most of these factory jobs are that they came to work in. So most of these immigrants are going to settle down into the United States, into these cities like New York. You can see here, this is an early picture of Ellis Island. It's the point of entry for many immigrants into the United States. It was the main point of entry on the East Coast. On the West Coast, it was known as Angel Island near San Francisco. And from the South, most people from Mexico passed through El Paso. Okay. Many of these immigrants are going to have a hard time adjusting, even those that might be from a culture that is similar to the United States. Even those immigrants are going to have a hard time adjusting. Now, the reason that immigrants come to the United States in the first place is because they see the United States as a land of opportunity, right? They see the United States as a land of freedom. And that's the whole reason they came over here in the first place, to make something out of themselves. Now, it's actually kind of interesting. most immigrants really didn't have plans to stay in the United States forever. It's kind of like when we were talking about prospectors in the far west. The idea was you move out to California, you strike it rich, then you go back east to live out a life of luxury. Well, a lot of these immigrants had those same kind of dreams in their head. The idea was you would move to the United States, you make some money, then you go back home once you have made something of yourself and you've made some money, and you can live off that money. And of course, most of the time that did not happen. An immigrant moved to the United States and they were usually here permanently. Now, one of the reasons they find it so hard to adjust is because many of these new immigrants are from agrarian society. You know, they're used to a rural agrarian lifestyle. Maybe they own their own farm. Maybe they just worked on the farm. But the movement from, you know, your culture in an agrarian setting over to an urban setting, not knowing the language, not knowing the customs, not knowing the culture, that is a very jarring transition, right? It's known as culture shock. And a lot of these immigrants are finding it hard to adjust and assimilate into American life. And so what they end up doing is creating ethnic communities for themselves. They create these ethnic communities for support. This is where we begin to see the birth of Little Italies and Chinatowns and German towns, places where their culture, you know, maybe within Little Italy they all speak Italian. Maybe they don't have to abandon that culture altogether. Maybe they can practice, you know, maybe Catholicism. Many Italian immigrants were Catholics, and, you know, it's hard to adjust into Protestant American culture. So they create Little Italy where they can speak their language, where they can practice their religion, and it's a support network for them. By the time we reach 1910, 1/7 of the United States was foreign born. And so these are substantial numbers of immigrants. These are very sizable ethnic communities that grow up in some of these cities. By 1900, New York has more people of Irish descent than Dublin. Think about that for a second. By 1900, more Irish are living in New York City than live in Dublin, Ireland. That's amazing. That's huge. And eventually, we are going to see feelings of nativism begin to rise up in the United States. Nativism is a feeling of hostility against immigrants. And it's funny, back during these days, people would argue for the rights of Native Americans. And when they said Native Americans, they weren't referring to what we would refer as a Native American today. They weren't referring to Indians. When they said, we want rights for Native Americans, they were talking about people born in the United States as opposed to an immigrant. So we see all these organizations that are calling for immigration restriction. For example, the American Protective Association, which was dedicated to stopping immigration, or the Immigration Restriction League, which was okay with immigration, but only for the quote-unquote right sort of immigrants. They wanted to screen immigrants to make sure they were wealthy, they were educated, they could assimilate into the American society. In the end, most of these anti-immigrations don't get passed because there is enormous financial pressure from corporate America to continue feeding the factories. They need this cheap labor to produce goods more cheaply so they can keep their costs down, so they can sell more stuff. So even though we do see pretty hostile feelings towards immigrants during this time, not a whole lot comes of it politically because big business welcomed the cheap labor. Okay, let's talk about the urban landscape. As the cities begin to grow, they do so rather haphazardly. And you can see this with a lot of older downtown districts even today. You go downtown, the roads are narrow, they're crooked, they're not laid out in a sensible pattern. They meet at all these funny different angles. There's one-way streets all over the place. That's because as cities grew, nobody really had a master plan for growing these cities. You would have the nucleus of the city, and then as more people came to the city, they would just keep building further and further out and out and out and out with no rhyme or reason, no no master plan. It wasn't until the 1850s that people finally began to sit down and say, okay, cities are growing. We have to prepare for this new growth. Let's construct our streets in a grid-like fashion. Let's make sure we put all the industry over here in this particular industrial park to keep it away from the residential areas. All right. So as we move into the 1850s and 60s and 70s, people are for the first time beginning to plan out these huge cities. For example, the innovation of public space. This, of course, is Central Park in New York City, which was created in 1857. People began to realize the importance of green space in these urban cities. They began things like the great library systems, museums and opera houses and theaters, all these different public amenities. Now, it should be noted, the driving force behind many of these new amenities are going to be the wealthy. Only the wealthy had time to, take a carriage ride in Central Park. Only the wealthy had the education to take part in, opera or theater or whatever. They want the wealthy of these cities, the factory owner class, they wanted these amenities. They want this social distinction between the haves and the have-nots. We see the growth of suburbs around and outside the cities as land inside the city became more and more expensive because there's only so much land to go around, right? As land inside the city became more expensive, people began buying up land outside the city to build their houses. And the idea was you buy land more cheaply outside the city, you can afford to build a house, and then to work, you just go into the city every day. And so suburbs became a huge part of American life. Maybe not right now, but by the time we get to the 1930s and 40s, certainly suburbia in the United States is a huge part of our culture. However, most of the working class could not afford houses out in the suburbs. That's mainly a middle class that's a middle class thing, living in the suburbs. Working class, most of them lived in these apartment buildings known as tenements. And today, the word tenement definitely has a negative connotation. A tenement is a densely populated apartment building. So what was happening was, even, they certainly couldn't afford a house out in the suburbs. They couldn't even afford living space inside the city. And so you have maybe 2 or 3 families packed into an apartment designed for one family. Maybe they don't have running water. Maybe they don't even have a window. What we see in some of these apartment buildings, especially on the interior apartments, those rooms on the inside of the building, they have no access to fresh air. They don't have a window to the outside, so they actually have ventilation shafts. They don't have air conditioning at this point, obviously. They actually have a pipe that leads up to the roof to give them fresh air because they don't have access to a window. As you might imagine, this is a breeding ground for disease, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. As cities grow, we do see new forms of transportation. Cars are not especially popular right now, at least not yet. Roads are unpaved and narrow, and so we see things like the elevated trains, subways, trolley systems, things of this nature. We also see the birth of skyscrapers. Like I said, land is at a premium, so you can't build out. But as technology increased and building materials grew in quality, people realized you could build up. Not build out, but build up. And so we see the birth of skyscrapers. This is the building that is commonly referred to as the first skyscraper in the United States. It always kind of makes me chuckle. This is the Wainwright building, built in 1891 in St. Louis. And the reason I kind of chuckle is because it is all of 10 stories high. You think of a skyscraper today, you think of dozens of stories. But this is the first acknowledged skyscraper in the United States, a today modest 10-story building in downtown St. Louis. I mentioned these problems with urban life. Yes, the jobs are there. Yes, people move to the city, maybe for the amenities, maybe for the jobs, but it's not always smooth sailing. Fire and disease. Most of these buildings, I won't say all, most of these buildings are made out of wood. Modern fire departments really hadn't come into being yet. Some of parts of these cities don't have running water. So when one fire breaks out, such as San Francisco, right? San Francisco has almost completely burnt to the ground a number of times in its history. No running water, close living spaces, a lot of people packed in together. Only a rudimentary understanding of modern germ theory led to widespread disease. Things like smallpox and cholera, typhoid run rampant through these early urban communities. Pollution is a huge problem that not many people understand at this point in time. There are no governmental regulations on factories. Nobody is telling factories they can't dump all their used chemicals into the river. Nobody's telling people what they have to do with their waste, and so they're just throwing it out in the streets. Pollution is a major, major problem in these early cities. Poverty. As I mentioned, the working class, they're incredibly poor. And one of the things that leads to is crime and violence, especially in the South, especially in the West. You have desperate people, you have crime and violence. And then lastly, machine politics. Machine politics is a uniquely American institution, and it all has to do, literally, it has to do with corruption. The political machine, such as the Tweed Ring, one of the more famous ones, it only exists to get their members elected into office so they can make money. So by using corruption, by using graft, bribes, by buying votes, they are able to get their members elected into office, and then from there, that's where the money flows. And there is a lot of political corruption going on in this time in the early American cities. All right, let's shift gears here for just a second. Talk about this consumer revolution. Maybe more than anything else, this is what leads to the founding of modern day America, right? As America moves past the Civil War into the 1900s, this is where our love affair with buying stuff begins. And if you know that may be the defining characteristic of American culture, of modern American culture, we love to buy stuff, and that really kicks off after the Civil War. It's building between the Civil War and the 1920s and 30s, and then as we exit the Great Depression, as we move into the 50s and 60s, it is going to explode. But it gets its start here in the late 1800s into the 1900s, the birth of mass consumption. We are buying more and more goods. With the development of things like mail order companies, even people who live in the country have access to some of these new goods and materials being produced in the cities. You can order stuff from any place in the country, and it'll arrive right to your doorstep. Entire houses. And it always blows my mind. You look at some of the old advertisements from places like Sears. They sold literal home kits. Order your own home kit through mail order, and they'll deliver it, and you can put it together yourself. We see the rise of chain stores. You can go to a store in San Francisco and a store in New York and a store in Chicago. They're all owned by the same company, and you can expect the same quality of goods. We see department stores, and this is what is really pretty amazing. Previously, in order to do your shopping, you had to go to all these different stores, right? You had to go to the clothing store to pick up your clothing. You had to go to the general store to pick up your dry goods. You had to go to the hardware store to get your tools. You had to go to all these separate stores. The idea of department stores is you have everything under one roof. You have all these diverse goods under one roof. It's one-stop shopping. But more than that, what is amazing is that they managed to convince people that shopping is fun. That was the idea. Shopping is now an experience to be enjoyed. It wasn't a chore that you had to do. You had to You had to weed the garden, you had to do the laundry, you had to do the shopping. No, it was no longer a chore in a mini list of chores. Now it was an experience that you could expect to enjoy. And so you would spend the afternoon shopping. You'd go to the department store. They would have restaurants. They would have salespeople to wait on you and to help you. Shopping is now a fun experience. And these new establishments and these new practices allow more products to reach a wider market than ever before. Now again, it won't really explode until we move into the 30s and 40s, but the promise is there that the seed has been planted. Probably the best example of this new consumer society is going to be Henry Ford. And as we mentioned last time, Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he perfected the means of production that brought it to millions of ordinary Americans. Advances in the moving assembly line allowed goods to be produced cheaper than ever before. For example, before the moving assembly line, a Model T took over 12 hours to produce. After the invention or perfecting, after implementing the assembly line, that production time fell to less than 2 hours, to around an hour and a half. That's amazing. You make goods quicker, you make them more cheaply, you can sell them for a cheaper price, more people are going to buy them. Now, Henry Ford was always kind of interesting. He paid a good wage for his factories. His workers made decent money, but there was no unionization, any hint of unionization, and he stamped that out quick. And we'll actually talk about that in just a little bit. Paid good, but no unions. We also see changing opportunities for women. This shifting economy offers more opportunities for women. And partially it is going to be because of more job openings for women workers. Things like telephone operators will mainly be regarded as quote-unquote women's work. Receptionists, sales clerks, things of this nature. Yes, there are going to be more job opportunities for women. That's true. More women are working in public than probably ever before in American history. Now, still, they are going to face wage discrimination and job exclusion. More women are working outside the home. But probably more than women as workers in the public sector, women are going to be more visible as shoppers. And the reason for this is a shift in the way that the woman provided for her family. So let me give you an example. Previously, the man was in charge of the life outside the home, and the woman was in charge of producing the goods inside the home. So, previous to this industrial revolution, maybe the husband, the dad, was in charge of the farm life. And so he went out every day and he tended the cattle, or he tended the crops, or he mended fences, or whatever it may be. Not to say that the women didn't help him, but that was his area of expertise. That's where he was in charge. Whereas the woman was in charge of the home. She was the one who prepared the meals. She was the one who sewed the clothes for her family. She was the one involved in the raising of children. Now, in this shifting consumer society, those roles have changed. Now the husband is no longer going out and tending the cattle and mending the fences and tending the row crops. Now he's going out working in a factory, working for a wage, and he brings home money at the end of the day. He's not out slaughtering a cow for dinner. He's bringing home money. And so the woman's job, she's still responsible for the household, but how she does that is changing. She's no longer preparing the clothes herself. She's using that money to purchase clothes. She's no longer, preparing the meals totally from scratch herself. Maybe she's going out to the market to buy the stuff she needs to prepare for dinner. So what I'm getting at is this. Instead of producing the goods needed for a household to function, women were now expected to purchase them. Women are now in charge of the money. Not making the money, but they're in charge of spending the money. And as companies begin to realize women control the money, they begin to cater to them. And they realize that they have to get on their good side. They realize They have to talk to them. They're not talking to the men to sell them the products because the men aren't buying them. They're talking to the women. And so with that comes a lot of power and a lot of visibility. Once women begin to control the household budget, that comes with substantial power and visibility in the public sector. Not only do we see the mass consumption of manufactured goods, we also see the mass consumption of leisure activities. Things like world-famous Coney Island, things like vaudeville shows and the Nickelodeons. One reason for this, now that more people are wage laborers, their lives are more sharply divided into units of time, and that's not a good way of phrasing that. So, and as a farmer, your job never really ends, right? There are no off days for farmers. There's always something to be done, and it doesn't matter if the cattle get out at 1 o'clock in the morning, or the cattle get out at noon, or the cattle get out at 5 o'clock in the evening. When something happens, you have to go fix it. There's no off time and on time. But when you're working for a wage, now you have your life much more structured. You have the 10 or 12 or 14 hours at work, and then you have the time you're off work. You have the days that you work, and you have the days that you don't work. For example, this is when nationally recognized days off like the 4th of July and Christmas and Thanksgiving. This is when these days become very big because for the first time in American history, people have this more structured calendar of their life, and they know, okay, I know on Sundays I'm going to be off. I know on July 4th I'm going to be off. And so everyone flocks to Coney Island. Everyone flocks to the spectator sports, right? Baseball. This is when baseball becomes huge in the United States. It becomes the national pastime. Football begins to rise. Boxing gets very popular in the United States. Mass consumed leisure activities. Now, this industrialization and consumer culture is going to have an unintended side effect. It's going to broaden people's ideas of freedom and entitlement. Well, we're going to see the growth of advertising as big business in the United States. As we shift from capital goods, producing steel and iron, to consumer goods, things people buy, advertising is going to grow along with that. Because it's not enough to make people aware of your product, right? You have to convince them that your product is better and that they will be a better person if they buy your product, right? One trick that a lot of advertising firms used during this time was to associate the product with some idea of freedom. Buy Liberty soap and your life will be better, right? And what happens as time goes on, people begin talking about the American way of life and the American standard of living. The idea was if we could just produce enough stuff, we could produce equality. That was kind of the idea. And so the ability to buy stuff almost becomes a right in the eyes of Americans. That as an American, you should have the expectation that a good job will be available to you and you can go work that job for 50 or 60 hours a week. Excuse me, bring home a decent paycheck and buy the stuff. That's the American way of life. And as an American, you should have access to a certain standard of living, right? That you should be able to buy the radios and the clothes and the food that is your station, that is your my mind's gone blank, sorry. This American standard of living, as an American working in America, you should have access to a good job that allows you to buy this stuff. And if you don't, and this is where it kind of goes off the rails, if you can't buy this stuff because you don't have a job that allows you to do that, that is where people begin to get upset. The idea is I'm an American, I should have access to a good job, and I go to this job, and I work hard, and I bring home the paycheck, and then I can buy the stuff that makes me happy. And if I can't find that good job, if I don't bring home enough money to buy the stuff, that is going to be a denial of my rights as an American. And you're denying me my American way of life, and you're denying me my American standard of living. And so people begin to complain about this. This is what leads to unionization. This is what leads to the demands for higher wages and a shortened work week and overtime pay and things of this nature. These complaints of a loss of freedom, not only from the poor laborers, but sometimes from the middle class as well. This white-collar loss of freedom. Not just people working on the line, but maybe from people in middle management. As we mentioned in the last chapter, as these companies grow, a lot of these middle management positions, accountants, shipping and receiving clerks, or whatever the case may be, they're not at the bottom of the ladder, they're not at the top of the ladder, they're kind of there in the middle. Well, the idea is, for a lot of these people, I could have been my own boss. If I didn't have to compete with Standard Oil and I didn't have to compete with U.S. Steel, right? I can't go up against these giant corporations. But, in better times, I could have owned my own business. I could have been my own boss. And I can't do that because I can't compete with the DuPonts and the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts of the United States. I've lost some of my freedom because I have to participate in, giant big business in the United States. And so people begin talking about industrial freedom. People begin talking about things like industrial democracy. And so that they begin asking themselves, we have a lot of political liberty, right? We have probably the most political freedoms of any country in the world at this point in time. But what is the use of having all these political liberties and freedoms if we feel like we're slaves to industry, right? And that is going to be the growing discussion as we move into the 1900s, into the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And we will see the growth of unionization. We will see the growth of socialism as a not only accepted but respected part of American political life in the early 1910s into the 20s. I want to make the point, it's not just the working class that have these feelings that they're getting left behind. Middle class Americans are also having the same argument. Okay, let's talk about culture for just a little bit. Because people begin to talk about this idea of quote-unquote high culture. The idea that elite people have different pursuits than those of the working class. The wealthy go to the opera, the working class go to baseball games. The wealthy go to museums, the working class go to Coney Island, right? The idea that the factory owners and the factory workers have two different pursuits. And so this leads to a very interesting dichotomy in American cities, because maybe within just a block or two of one another, you have the very, very rich and then you have the very, very poor. You have the people who are living in mansions and you have the people who are living in tenements. You have the people who spend their evenings at the opera and you have the people who spend their evenings at boxing matches, right? And so that's kind of the idea that this sharp social distinction is beginning to grow really for the first time in American culture. Now, there's always been the haves and the have-nots going all the way back to the colonial days, but people prided themselves on their equality. People prided themselves on their egalitarianism. Now, for really the first time in American culture, really beginning in the mid-1800s, but now certainly stretching into this birth of mass consumerism, people are not priding themselves on being equals. People are priding themselves on having these distinctions. We see authors address this. Stephen Crane and Theodore Dreiser. Probably one of the most famous is this guy right here, Upton Sinclair. And you can tell just by looking at him, he's an angry man. He's an angry old man. And Upton Sinclair is a famous author of numerous works. But probably his most famous is a book called The Jungle. And The Jungle is all about the plight of a immigrant by the name of Jurgis Rudkus. He's a Lithuanian immigrant who moves to Chicago. He gets married to his childhood sweetheart. He starts a family. They move to the United States, and they bring all their extended family as well. They bring grandparents, they bring parents, they bring aunts and uncles and cousins. They all uproot from Lithuania and move to the United States to pursue that American dream. And of course, once they get to the United States, instead of the easy life that they expect, they find something very different. That they are taken in by American con men, that they have to deal with unscrupulous and greedy bosses. They think that Jurgis will go to work and he will provide for the entire family, but everybody has to go to work. Everyone's health fails. People die, and eventually Jurgis is the only one left out of his family and his extended family. He has lost all faith in the American dream. He is homeless. He's penniless. He doesn't have a job. And after his wife literally dies in the street giving birth to his child who doesn't survive, he's wandering the streets, wondering what to do with himself now. And eventually he does find the answer. And we'll talk about what that answer is a little bit more. Upton Sinclair was an avowed socialist. In fact, he was a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party who ran for governor of California. He didn't win, but he put up a pretty good fight. And so we'll talk about the growth of socialism again in upcoming chapters. But anyway, to Upton Sinclair, that was the answer to these problems, was the growth of a socialist movement in the United States. Okay, fine. Darwinism, we've already spoken about social Darwinism in the past chapter, but just Darwinism itself. A lot of people saw it as a challenge to biblical history. But maybe more than that, it also shows this schism between the cosmopolitan city and the traditional country. And eventually, Darwinism is going to give rise to a new, almost uniquely American philosophy known as pragmatism. Pragmatism is a philosophy that is concerned with doing what works. And so we see American philosophers like William James and John Dewey, who argue that modern society should rely on scientific inquiry, not traditions. Don't do something the way it's always been done because it's the way it's always been done. Do what works. Rely on facts, not traditions, to guide society. As America industrializes, we also see a demand for educated people. We see the spread of free primary and secondary education in the United States. We see the growth of colleges and universities in the United States, and even education not just for men, but for women as well. And again, it won't really kick off until after World War II, but these seeds of American modern society that is built on the idea of consumerism, that is built on the idea of free public education, that is built on the idea of technology and efficiency. These seeds of modern American society are going to be planted in the years between the Civil War and the dawn of the new 20th century.